Now on Pennsylvania Newsmakers, nearing a state budget impasse record. Will there ever be a breakthrough? Secretary of Planning and Policy John Hanger joins us after his boss, Governor Tom Wolf, called a state budget that he had to line item veto garbage. Then with a Republican rebuttal, Senate Majority Spokesperson Jenn Kocher joins us in the studio. Then tying it all up with a bow for us, Auditor General Eugene DePasquale talks about the impact of the budget impasse on schools and the state's junk bond status. We get in the weeds on the state budget when Pennsylvania Newsmakers starts after these messages.
This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers, a fast-paced, unrehearsed weekly discussion with and about the leaders who shape your world. And now, here's your host.
Joining us on Pennsylvania Newsmakers, I'm Pete Muntean with WGAL TV News 8. Dr. Madonna has the week off. A longtime guest to the show, Secretary of Planning and Policy John Hanger joins us now. And Secretary Hanger, tell us, why did the governor call the budget that he had to line item veto a garbage budget?
Well, first and foremost, it doesn't balance. It has a $500 million hole in it this fiscal year, a $500 million deficit. And that deficit explodes to over $2 billion starting July 1. And that's not just Governor Wolf saying that. It's Standard & Poor's, the Wall Street independent rating agency, that put out a bulletin warning investors about that budget being, in fact, garbage because it has those huge deficits built into it. The second reason why it is, in fact, a budget that had to be vetoed is it contained a $95 million cut in education. After all of this effort to finally reverse the cuts made by Governor Corbett and the previous Republican legislatures on education, they still, to this moment, trying to reduce funding to our schools.
Let's get to a macro level for a little bit. Why should Pennsylvanians still care about the budget impasse? I think people sort of groan when they hear about it at this point, and they feel like it could have ended so many times, and it still hasn't.
Well, unfortunately, the Pennsylvanians are right that this is a mess. It's a mess built by a radical right-wing speaker, Speaker Turzai, who's determined to blow agreements up. The governor's had 3 agreements with Republican leaders, handshakes with the cameras rolling, and in all cases, they've been broken to one degree or another. And Speaker Turzai has been consistently trying to blow up these agreements. Now, what's at stake here is the state's fiscal finances. We have a financial mess on our hands because after 4 years of irresponsible budgeting and 5 debt downgrades, this Republican-controlled legislature is trying to do a 5th year of fiscal irresponsibility that will wreck our finances and lead to draconian budget cuts within less than 6 months.
You're angry.
Yeah, we're pretty outraged at this point. We spent 12 months bending over backwards, compromising, shaking hands with Republican leaders who then turn around and break their word. We've had a bipartisan budget passed through the Senate 43-7, and let me thank them for doing that. Let me thank Majority Leader Corman for doing that. It was pending for a final vote in the House. We had the votes. And Speaker Turzai then just adjourned the House because we had the votes and he didn't want that bipartisan budget to get to the governor's desk. So all Pennsylvanians should be outraged at this point.
But devil's advocate, lawmakers say that they have done their job and they felt content with being able to give you a budget and then ultimately go home. But have they done their job?
Absolutely not. Again, Standard & Poor's, the well-known Wall Street investment rating agency, says that so-called budget that was dumped on the governor's desk when they ran out of town right before Christmas has a $500 million deficit in it for this current fiscal year that explodes to $2 billion on July 1. It's time for the Republican General Assembly to face the financial facts. It's not Governor Wolf, it's not John Hanger delivering this message. It's Wall Street independent rating agencies who put a credit rating on the bonds of the Commonwealth. They're saying it. So those are the financial facts. I don't like those financial facts. Governor Wolf doesn't like those financial facts. But Governor Wolf is a business person, and he faces up to the financial facts.
But the Republicans are in the majority in the Senate and the House, and often they're tax shy, and they fear tax hikes and a compromised budget that seemed to be likely right before Thanksgiving and then sort of got obliterated. So what do you say to those who fear tax hikes? You got to use some sort of revenue to balance the budget the governor wants.
You've got to actually find new revenues simply to fill the budget hole that we have. And yes, the governor is absolutely continuing to advocate for important investments in our schools, our early childhood, and our higher education institutions. Let's remember this, that higher education institutions, the Millersvilles, the Shippensburg, two examples in this area, have a funding level at 1998 levels. 1998 state funding level. It's outrageous how underinvested this Republican legislature is in education, and that must stop. Now, the Republicans can say they're against taxes, and if they continue that position and they won't raise any revenues, then they own $2 billion of cuts. $1 billion of cuts in education, $1 billion of cuts in human services, and they own the property tax increases that will flow through to so many property owners at the local level.
Last question. When do you see this wrapping up? We're only less than a month away from the governor's next budget address. So does he conceivably have to look at trying to piece together two budgets when we near June 30th, 2016?
Well, the first thing is the Speaker of the House could get out of the way and stop blowing up deals. And if the House came back into session, they could finish their budget work in 1 hour. There's a bill waiting for the final vote, and they could finish that in 1 hour. So there's no excuse not to get this done well before February 9th, which is when the governor must deliver his second budget address.
Keeping it fast-paced here on Pennsylvania Newsmakers. When we come back, the Republican rebuttal from Senate Majority spokesperson Jenn Kocher. Then later in the show, Auditor General Eugene DePasquale talks about the impact of the budget impasse on schools after these messages.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association and Partners for Public Education, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
Thanks for staying with us on Pennsylvania Newsmakers. After a fiery Secretary John Hanger, Senate Majority spokesperson Jenn Kocher joins us now. And Secretary of Hanger said that lawmakers need to get back to the table. What's the plan going forward? He says that they need to work on the governor's budget. But you guys say you already passed a budget.
We've passed 3 budgets, actually. We did one by the statutory deadline of June 30th, which the governor then vetoed in its entirety, which then put us into the crisis. And he admittedly said so when he did this partial veto the last time, where he signed the budget but then cut out some of the lines. He said the schools and social service agencies can't be held hostage any longer. He had been doing that all along. And so it's something where we're in a difficult situation. We continue to send the governor reasonable, responsible budgets. And every time we do so, he just wants more taxes. That's what this is about with this governor at this point, is the need for more taxes.
Do you think just beyond taxes, the pressure point is off lawmakers to come back to the table because there's money going to schools, because there's money now going to social services with the budget that you guys passed to the governor and that he lined out and vetoed, but it did release that money?
No, not at all. We understand, and that's the thing. We've been working. We're there every day. We are negotiating. There are meetings. The staff is always meeting along the lines. But the members themselves are there. We don't need 253 people sitting around the negotiating table with Mr. Hanger. If he'd like to negotiate with that many people, then the progress would be even slower. But at this point, what we're looking at is trying to continue the negotiations and continue to move forward. We're looking a lot at the House. We need a lot of the things to come out of the House before we can do anything with it in the Senate.
So with a lot of lawmakers now back in their districts, a lot of attention is on this framework and compromise deal coming back to the table. You say with rank and file gone, that doesn't necessarily negate work going forward if the governor still wants that.
No, it doesn't at all. We continue to meet. The leaders and negotiators continue to meet. The rank and file members are needed in their districts. They're meeting with their communities. They're doing work in their communities and doing the things that they normally do to provide services and to ensure that citizens have access to state government. It doesn't have anything to do with them sitting around a negotiating table or sitting in Harrisburg waiting for something to happen or waiting for a call from the governor. We haven't heard from him since his veto. We haven't heard any fresh or new ideas from him.
How much did the governor's rhetoric, when he had that press conference saying, I was there, where he said the budget that the Senate passed on to him on December 23rd was a garbage budget and he had no choice but to lie on and veto it. Was the rhetoric too high there, and did it work against him?
It was certainly disappointing. We feel that we are well beyond the time for name calling, and that it was something that it was something where he didn't need to go there. We understand that that was not the budget that he wanted. He doesn't seem to understand is that no budget is going to be perfect, and he's not going to get everything that he wants. He is not going to get the $4 billion in taxes that he wants to do the things that he wants to do, especially since we have yet to see any type of spending cuts come from him. At this point, where we are is we're headed back to that table. We were disappointed because we had continued to work in good faith with him. The reason that budget landed on his desk was because that was the only way to get money to the schools. He, for 6 months, had denied schools and social service agencies money by fully vetoing the budget and then by vetoing a stopgap budget. He was the lone person who denied money for schools and social service agencies. So this was our third attempt to try to get money out to those people so that as we continue to work through the process in Harrisburg, the communities no longer had to suffer at his hands.
And not an attempt for lawmakers to wipe their hands of something on the eve of Christmas Eve and be able to go home.
Heavens no. We recognize that this was the way to get money to our kids and to keep schools open. We know also that that schools were having to pay interest payments and large sums of money that they didn't need to pay because we had provided that funding earlier in a lot of that budgeting. And again, the governor chose to veto that.
Will the Senate possibly look at some sort of interest help for schools that have taken out loans that need to ultimately pay that interest? The governor points to that not being in the budget that he had to line out and veto.
In the end, that would be part of the negotiations as we move forward.
What do you think is the ultimate timeline here? I mean, the governor's budget address is only a month away for the 16-17 budget. So does he conceivably, and lawmakers conceivably look at working on two budgets in tandem?
We're not sure where the next step will be. We're not sure how the governor will give a budget address when he hasn't completed the job the first time. This is something where we continue to give him plans and continue to give him opportunities to pass a budget that doesn't cost $4 billion in taxes. And so, but that's the reason that he says that he's vetoing is because his tax increases are not in there. The increases for education, all of the other things that he wanted are in there in some piece or form. Is it 100% what he wants? No. But the things that are priority for us too, things like education. And he continues to veto because it's not 100% of his goals. So we're not sure if you can't accomplish the one, how do you move on to the second?
Why do taxes remain such a huge sticking point, though? I mean, the governor did, during his campaign, say that he was going to change the tax structure in some way. Granted, he didn't say he wanted to raise the state sales tax. He did say he wanted to restructure the personal income tax, and he did say he wanted a tax on drillers. So why does that come as such a surprise to lawmakers?
I don't know that I think because part of it is that it was $4 billion. It wasn't something where it was a little bit here or a little bit there, which maybe people can understand a little bit, but $4 billion in increased state spending without ever showing us a plan for savings. There's no cuts, there's no savings plan, there's nothing. There's just, I want more money to spend. I need $4 billion from taxpayers to do that. And one of the things in our budgets that we have previously done was 4 years ago, there was an $8 billion deficit. We had cut that to $4 billion, and we're on track this year that it'll be $2 billion, all without raising taxes, all through responsible budgeting and spending and cuts where we felt that it needed to be made. And so that's something that can't be discounted. So if reducing the deficit, cutting it in half and then cutting it in half again is garbage or not responsible, then he needs to go back to the drawing table and come up with a different solution.
Senate Majority Spokesperson Jenn Kocher on Pennsylvania Newsmakers. Up next, Auditor General Eugene DePasquale talks about the impact of the state budget impasse on schools and when they could get some help with that interest that they need.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Pennsylvania Credit Union Association. Pennsylvania Credit Unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, check out ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Hospital and Health System Association of Pennsylvania, working towards a healthy Pennsylvania, and by the Pennsylvania Coal Alliance, representing companies involved in America's most affordable, reliable energy source. To learn more, visit pacoalalliance.com.
Thanks for staying with us on Pennsylvania Newsmakers. Auditor General Eugene DePasquale joins me now to talk about the impact of the state budget impasse. And Auditor General DePasquale, tell me why this $2 billion line of credit, the latest news to keep the state in the black, is such a big deal.
Each time the state has had to do this in the past, and this is not the only time, but each time it's basically because a real budget hasn't been passed, where the expenses and the revenues haven't matched up. Now, some of it can be understood in the revenues haven't come in yet, but we're basically dealing with a $2 billion line of credit just to keep the lights on in state government. That should be concerning, especially considering that a comprehensive budget hasn't been passed yet.
Why should Pennsylvanians care about this? I mean, the state's taking out a loan, in essence.
The state is taking out a loan for something that isn't infrastructure. The state has taken out loans before. A lot of times you do investment in roads, bridges, school buildings, infrastructure, stuff you're going to keep. This, in a sense, taking out a loan just to pay for the groceries.
Does this put the state in further risk of its credit rating going down?
This is the best option of bad options. So doing this line of credit was the least expensive way for the treasurer to try to make sure that the lights stayed on for state government. But when you take a step back, it's not good that it had to happen. And I do think without a real budget passed soon, it's going to further dampen the state's financial creditworthiness.
You're the state's fiscal watchdog. What's your biggest concern? I mean, there's interest on this, too.
My biggest concern from day one has been that there hasn't been an agreed-to budget that makes the proper investments in education, makes us more competitive on taxes, and also moves us forward in a way that can help grow our businesses and help our kids get a better education. That has been my biggest concern, and every day it takes to get to a budget that does that is another day lost for the state of Pennsylvania.
Perfect segue into talking about the impact on schools because of the budget impasse. And the latest budget bill does nothing for the interest that schools have incurred because they've had to take out loans because they haven't been getting their state payments. So what's the problem there?
Every school that had to take out a loan, and they had to take out that loan through no fault of their own. School districts are promised state money. They're basically told at the beginning of the calendar year to pass a budget based on what the state is supposed to give them. When the state didn't do that, they had to take out loans to make up the difference. So the state is basically telling school districts that had to take out a loan, you're going to have to make other cuts or raise property taxes to make up for that. And the school districts did nothing to put themselves in that position.
Schools are getting some money, though, in the budget that the governor line item vetoed, but still released some of the money. So does that help them right now?
Well, yes.
Is it enough help?
You can obviously have a debate about whether it's enough help, but certainly without that money being released, some school districts are going to be forced to close. So it was critical that that money went out the door to those school districts.
We'll be back with Auditor General Eugene DePasquale after the break.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine. And by the Pennsylvania Healthcare Association, the future of long-term care. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Business Council and by the Pennsylvania Business Council Education Foundation.
Auditor General Eugene DePasquale and I share one big thing in common, that we're both big Star Wars fans. And we've made a few puns here. May the force be with these school districts who are getting some money but still don't know where the next 6 months of money will come from, even in the state budget impasse.
And the state is basically forcing school districts to use Jedi mind tricks to try to come up with what their next budget's going to be, because they don't even know what they're getting from the state, to take the Star Wars analogy even further.
So the timing is the big problem here. It's sort of the plight of school districts that's continuing every year, but this year it's almost to the power of 2.
Well, it's timing and not knowing what you're getting. So there's a debate about what the overall funding is going to be, and they haven't received their full funding yet. So it's really putting school districts in a no-win situation. They have to, under state law, put these budgets together, but they don't know what level of funding they're getting, so they can't even make strategic decisions.
Every school district is in a bad spot, but some are even in a worse spot because they're not sure how they're going to get this interest paid back.
Correct. There's two parts to this. One is every school district in the state gets some level of state funding, but some get more than others. The ones that rely more on state funding obviously are in a more precarious situation. That's A. B, all of them, though, are in the same situation of not knowing what they're getting.
The trickle down to taxpayers is another big problem here. You've forecasted that maybe property taxes would go up because of this interest. And granted, we're looking at school districts across the map, right?
Right. You have about $50 million total in interest interest payments that are going to need to be made because school districts had to borrow because they weren't getting their money from the state. That $50 million is going to come from somewhere. And what I've said is either if the state's not going to cover the tab for the $50 million, those school districts are going to have to do one of two things: either cover it with property taxes, or they're going to have to make cuts to other academic programs. There's simply no way around it. That $50 million is going to get paid somehow.
The impasse seems likely to continue for a little while longer. In September, you said it might just take one weekend for lawmakers to lock themselves in a room and figure this out. What's your opinion now?
The number one thing I think everyone needs to focus on, again, it's easier said than done for me because I'm not one of the ones negotiating this, but I think people have to stop worrying about who to blame for the impasse and start focusing on what they can do to try to solve the problem. And that's everybody. That's number one. Number two, you have to find out what is the art of the possible. You know, everyone, all of us, we have our own point of view. And then at some point when you have divided government, there's got to be some level of compromise on this. And the compromise needs to be on how do you make sure Pennsylvania stays competitive on taxes and moves us forward on education so that every child has an equal opportunity to learn. That should be the two priorities, not who's winning the short-term media soundbite game.
You're a former lawmaker. How should lawmakers, or why should lawmakers, come back to the table? Is it productive to have rank and file there? I mean, it seems like they're on an extended holiday by all intents.
It is important, in my view, and having gone through this once before with an extended budget when I was a member of the House, that you let your leadership know. Because, look, you're not going to have a negotiation with 250 people in the room. Okay, it just doesn't work. But you do have to have your leadership that's in the room negotiating. You have to let them know exactly what you can and can't support, so when they negotiate on your behalf, they actually, you can cut a deal that makes sense.
A lively Pennsylvania Newsmakers with Auditor General Eugene DePasquale. Thanks to our guests. Dr. Madonna will be back next week. Have a good week ahead.